Good afternoon. I'm Douglas Klahr, and I'm the Associate Dean of the College of Architecture, Planning, and Public Affairs here at the University of Texas at Arlington. I'm going to be talking about slum housing today, and I want you to remember two things from the start. First, don't let the necktie fool you. I'm going to be offering a radical rethinking of how we educate people to deal with a global housing crisis in the developing world. And second, I'm going to be using a lot of text in here because I know that when this is on the web, I want people, when they view it on the web, to pause, to stop, and to carefully think about what I'm saying, because this is a very important topic for us to address. This is based upon an article, you see it up there on the screen, that was published, in 2011 by the ETH in Zurich. And it also led to me developing a course, that's the name of the article there, by the way, called Slum Housing. And I still teach this course. And the first time I taught it, it was supposed to have 20 students. We wound up with 54. So that tells you the need to have people talking about this honestly. I don't have to show you many pictures of slum housing in the developing world, but my point is that this is not affordable housing in the developed world. It is slum housing in the developing world, and I have to tell my students to be prepared for something that they have never, ever seen before. There are two words that I want you to keep in mind today: urgency and magnitude, because both of those are not addressed by our educational systems to deal with this crisis. So we can look at endless pictures of slum housing around the world. We'll stop at this one momentarily and just have you look at that and ask yourself who should be dealing with this type of housing. And I will tell you now that it should not be architects. They are not equipped to deal with this. Moreover, they are harmful to finding a solution to this. So I'm going to tell you who should be dealing with this, because no one has anyone dealing with this to address urgency and magnitude. Of course, some people are writing about this. You see different articles here on the screen questioning architects in slum housing around the world. My favorite, of course, was this one that happened a couple of years ago: Architects and Planners' Obstacles to Slum Upgrading. And you can guess by the tone of my voice that I think they most definitely are. For those of you who don't know what I'm showing you here on the screen, this is a typical scene in an architecture school around the world. You'll have very well-educated people, very well-intentioned people, critiquing minutiae of design over and over again until they're satisfied that a design has been resolved. This is not the way to approach this crisis. So, urgency and magnitude. What's wrong with that way that's taught in all of our architecture schools? And I don't care whether you take an affordable housing course in your school or whether you go on a summer project and build a house in a slum. That's not addressing the two issues that you see up there: urgency and magnitude. So what's wrong with our educational system right now? Well, first of all, the projects that we have are way too limited in scope. Second, they're too reflective as design exercises. And that word design, I'm going to probably beat to death here in this lecture for a good reason. Number three, these are way too leisured regarding their time frames, which goes back to urgency. And number four, they're totally incommensurate regarding materials. We do not solve this crisis using materials that we have in the developed world. We cannot solve the crisis. So we have to do away with this. So Adrian Forty wrote perhaps the best quote that I've ever seen about why architecture schools and architecture education no longer serve us well. And I'm going to read this for you so you listen to the words carefully. In architecture, he's talking about modern architecture, the effect was that what architects learned in their training ceased to be practice and became principles. In other words, a wholly dematerialized and cerebral version of the art. And what students produced from their training was not architecture, but drawings, commonly referred to as designs. The separation between architecture as a mental product, which was taught, and architecture as a practice engaged with the material world now emerged for the first time as a visible fact of life. Now, with the separation of education from practice, design, rather than being a convenient way of conceptualizing a particular feature of architecture, came to be seen as a pure and self-contained activity within itself. It's a lot of words, but as I say, when you pause and look at this on the web later on, you'll get it. Look at the words that I've done in red here. They emerge, and you begin to see something happening here, a separation between building and architecture. So, design, a pure and self-contained activity within itself. That is the problem. Let's go back to our jury here. Are these the people to solve this? Let's go back to the jury. They're well-intentioned, but are they the ones to begin solving the issue that I'm talking about today? And as you see, we fade into a tiny portion of a slum in Dharavi in Mumbai. So, design out. So, becoming builders again in an age of global crisis. We cannot permit students and practitioners to retreat comfortably to the familiar territory of an American, European, affordable housing design ethos that, although perhaps noble in intention, and I don't doubt that, has utterly failed to address the vast scale and exponentially growing magnitude of the crisis. That's the problem. Perhaps the time has come for us to return to our long-lost identities as builders. There is no other way for whatever outposts of social responsibility that remain within architectural practice have proven ineffectual, and the profession has remained numb to responding in appropriate dimensions and rapidity to the crisis. The era of well-intentioned yet small-scale interventions must end, for their seductively reassuring photo-op nature has lulled our profession into complacency, and that's the danger that I'm pointing out to you today. They're well-intentioned, but they have led us down the wrong path. So what do we do? What is needed, therefore, is not a feel-good add-on studio or two of participatory design, but rather an entire new pedagogy parallel to the existing one that will train experts, not designers, to respond to this crisis. We need a new paradigm focused upon resolving the slum housing crisis on a scale and pace that are commensurate with the magnitude and exponential growth of the problem. And so what do? We need a participatory housing practice, and that's what I'm terming it. Of course, this has been talked about for years, decades now. We go back to John Turner's book in the mid-'70s. We go back to a more recent book. We have articles that look at this. But no one's addressing the fact that we have to train different people for this. And that's what I'm talking about today. So what would this look like, this weird animal I'm proposing you today? Okay. It would be a truly transdisciplinary program from that first day that brings students interested in housing, sanitation, sociology, planning, and government. All five come together on that first day of school. They address these issues then. We address issues of dwelling, sanitation issues, social issues, urban planning issues, and of course, probably most important, municipal issues regarding land tenancy and financing. The goal is to train students to practice as a transdisciplinary team during their education, of course, afterwards in practice. So I'm going to quote just twice from this article by Arjan Appaduri. Listen to his description of a transdisciplinary coalition in the slums of Mumbai and see if this resonates with anything that we teach in our schools. The coalition cultivates a highly transparent, non-hierarchical, anti-bureaucratic, and anti-technocratic organizational style. A small clerical staff conscientiously serves the needs of the activists and not vice versa. That's important. Because everyday organizational activity is filled with meetings with contractors, lawyers, state officials, politicians, and between alliance members. Spatial fixity, meaning your location, is not valued, and the organization functions in and through mobility. The general impression is of a fast game of ice hockey with players constantly tumbling in and out of the most active roles in response to the shifting needs and game plans. What a great definition. So, his words provide a glimpse of what this really could be. So, the mobility of which Appaduri and I speak is true nimbleness of mind, not a simulacrum achieved through legions of computer programs and functionaries within a hothouse studio environment, but that's what we have currently. The mental nimbleness of which I speak entails communicating not with fellow architects, but rather with slum residents, using perhaps only pencils, pen, and paper to offer them the one ability that your transdisciplinary teammates cannot and do not possess, translating needs and requirements into imagery. The mental nimbleness of which I speak revels in using the most basic and inexpensive materials instead of following that siren song that murmurs, "Be advanced," by using cutting-edge technology and materials. So, participatory architecture practice. Why don't I call it that? Because of this. Now you know. We can't go that route. We've tried that route. It doesn't work. So, We have not trained architects to recognize the nuances and permutations that characterize what our profession has labeled informal settlements. For the dwellers of slums, however, those gradations and differentiations are as evident, as important as those that exist for the dwellers within the formal built environment of the city. How is it we remain unable to perceptively read and understand the urban environments of 1/6 of humanity? Our treatises may breathlessly expostulate upon the new urban forms of informal settlements that anesthetize the reader's vicarious experience via edgy photography. Yeah, we do that. However, as usual, we remain detached from actually doing anything other than small, overly celebrated interventions within these developing world slums. We are akin to doctors who cannot diagnose, much less treat, the most basic conditions of human life. Now, of course, there are good examples happening out there, but on a very small scale. Here's one book, for instance. You go into a slum in this particular part of India. You just don't map out the slum as architects would do. Roofscapes are important in this particular slum. People go from roof to roof, so you have to understand what's occurring above you as well. It's a basic, simple lesson. Over here, you don't show people a computer programming plan. You show them on a street with string what a 12-meter square room might look like so they get an idea of the dimensions. So all of this is coming together in a transdisciplinary team. And of course, slum residents become integral and vocal part of the process. So a critical question, of course, arises on account of all of this, okay? Because we're dealing with 1 billion people in developing world slums. If standardization and therefore mass production is antithetical to a true participatory housing practice, how does one propose to tackle the global slum housing crisis? The answer is not in mass production, but rather in massive amounts of small, nimble, transdisciplinary teams being assembled and deployed in slum areas. I'm making a deliberate distinction, by the way, between interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary. And I won't bother reading that right now, but you can look at it later on the web. So once more from Participatory. We have these teams, hundreds of them, in a loose federation. What does a federation mean in this instance? The primacy of the principle of federation also serves to remind all members, particularly trained professionals, that the power of the alliance lies not in its donors, its technical expertise, as we think it does, or its administration, but rather in the will to federate among poor families and communities. On another level, the image of the federation asserts the primacy of the poor in driving their own policies, however much others may help them to do so. So, akin to adjusting the lens on a camera, the vision of this practice now begins to come into focus. So, this is not some utopian dream. We know that at the end of the day, those team members get to leave the slum. We know that. The factors that conspire to make such alliances so difficult are daunting, but at the end of the day, we have no choice if we're going to solve this crisis. So we need visionaries within academia who are also activists, people who can shatter disciplinary boundaries and create learning programs that will equip students with the skills to become true transdisciplinary team members and good diagnosticians of slum dwellers' housing needs. We need students and practitioners to view a participatory housing practice as a legitimate professional endeavor, not as a brief internship, summer studio, or occasional pro bono work. That has not worked. We've tried it for 40 years. We need municipalities and governments to financially encourage people to pursue this career path. Finally, we need to train this new type of housing expert how to negotiate successfully with municipal officials, for they often hold the key to improving slum conditions due to the central issue of land ownership. If we don't know how to work with the governments, and most architects don't, we will never succeed in this. Ah, you exclaim. These are not subjects that should be taught in an architectural curriculum. For they have little to do, and here's that word again, with design. Imagine a building curriculum that is radically different. That is why we need to train, and we need to create a parallel program that focuses upon producing diagnosticians and practitioners of simple housing. That is why a participatory housing practice degree program needs to be independent. For the lure of regressing into our default designer setting is very strong, and I know this. It has to be completely independent, away from the architects. You keep them out of this program. Due to our training, it is our nature to socially, professionally, and psychologically distance ourselves from striding wholeheartedly into the unsavory topic of developing world slums. It's our nature. We're designers. We would rather hold sleekly presented competitions and earn student crits about affordable housing so we can insulate and isolate ourselves from the harsh reality that what is needed are not more designers, but thousands of good building practitioners. Let me repeat that. We do not need more designers. We need thousands of good, simple building practitioners. That's what the world needs. We'd rather donate money to yet another NGO that plants an administrative office in a slum, ignoring the reality that, for instance, over 700 NGOs have been in Kibera, Africa's largest slum, for several decades, all to negligible impact concerning housing and sanitation. Imagine that, 700 of them in this one slum, and decade after decade, nothing is done about the housing there. So you can have your feel-good moment at an NGO, but keep in mind, you're not solving the crisis. So, at the end of all of this, will this TED Talk pass largely unnoticed from the architectural scene, as my article did? Will it be too upsetting and too disruptive to shake ourselves from our academies and practices? Will we continue to tell ourselves that the distinction between architecture and building not only is a necessary one, but really a noble one? And finally, this is the most important point. Will we concoct in our brains the curious and defensive equation that the buildings we do bring into the world somehow compensate us for having made 1 billion souls, 2 billion if you include merely substandard housing, irrelevant to our profession? My sincerest hope is that the answer to each of these questions will be no. Thank you.